Hello and welcome to This is the Way, a podcast on Chinese philosophy. My name is Richard Kim.
And I'm Justin T. Wald.
Hi, Justin. It's been a while
Hi.
since we last talked. So what you been up to?
Well, I suppose the most notable thing that's happened to me since we last talked is that I finally checked another item off my bucket list and went to Greece, which means I got to see the ruins of Athens and the hometown for Aristotle, some other ruins from ancient Greece. And, basically, I know I'm a specialist in Chinese philosophy, so you would think that people who don't know any better might think that I care much more about seeing the kind of relics left over from ancient China than I do ancient Greece. But actually, at the end of the day, I really am just mostly interested in philosophy, and I'm in awe of the sort of cradles and foundations of philosophy wherever it arose. So, of course, I was very excited to see what could very well be the ruins of the prison where Socrates was kept for the last month of his life between his conviction and his execution.
As represented in the Apology.
Exactly, right. So he's convicted in this sort of public trial by the democratic tribunal of Athens, and that's represented in Plato's Apology, that kind of speeches and his defense speech and all that stuff. So, of course, I was just really reverent while I was there, especially in the ruins of the ancient agora, where so much philosophizing that became the sort of foundations of Western philosophy took place. Yeah. So anyway, it was really a moving experience for me, even though it was terribly hot and I was only able to make these trips in between lots of conferencing and that kind of stuff. So that's what I've been up to, but it's really actually as cool as it was for me. It's not nearly as cool. Can't even hold a candle to what's happened to you. You've had some major events in your life recently. Just to keep our audience apprised, Richard is, unlike me, he's a father, and he was already a father. Last time we heard from him, he was already a father of 3 children. Now we can add a 4th to your clan. You and your spouse, Xue Ying, welcomed a daughter.
Yes, that's right. Our daughter, Philippa Chen. Well, first of all, Philippa, have you known any Philippa, like personally?
No.
Neither have I.
It's such a name that we, like Richard was about to say, I know him well. Like, basically, if you're in moral philosophy these days, when you hear the name Philippa, you think of a really famous and important moral philosopher named Philippa Foot. And she was very cool and interesting thinker. And so I, of course, think it's this fantastic name. It also has, it sounds vaguely British and kind of, I don't know, erudite or scholarly. So it's a really good name.
Interestingly, so did you always pronounce it as Philippa or Philippa?
So I confess I didn't pay close enough attention. So I probably just pronounced it the way that came most naturally to me as a Midwestern American, which is to say Philippa.
Philippa. Okay, that is
yeah.
actually the way you're supposed to pronounce it.
Oh, okay.
Or at least is Philippa Foot. But I always said Philippa, and nobody ever corrected me. And the thing is, I went to UCLA. So Philippa Foot taught at UCLA for over a decade.
Yeah.
And she had a tremendous influence there. Unfortunately, she was gone by the time I went there as an undergrad. But she left her mark. And one of my closest professors, Gavin Lawrence, was a very dear friend of hers. And anyways, I got onto her writing. I thought she was so cool. She has this really interesting style of doing philosophy, which is kind of refreshing and feels, it's just interesting. I always admired her. And so there's the name. But actually, there's a little twist, Justin. So Philippa Foot is partly the inspiration, but another inspiration actually is there's this medieval Catholic saint named Saint Philip Neri, lived in the 1500s. Saint Philip Neri, he was kind of well known for his humor, wit, and just kind of this joyfulness. So even though he was personally very spiritual and pious, he was well known as someone who could live in the modern world and be comfortable wherever he was and wasn't dour or sullen. He was very cheerful. He thought that was very important. So there we go. So on the one hand, we have this kind of a secular British moral philosopher. And on the other hand, we got this Catholic saint from the medieval times. So we're crossing time and culture here, and hopefully just like our podcast.
Yeah.
And the middle name is Qian. So that's the Chinese character is the one for humility, for those of you who know some Chinese. And of course, Kim. Yeah. And maybe you could say a little bit about that. And of course, last name is Kim. My last name is Kim. That's like half of Koreans. So there it is.
Yes. Nice. So there's a kind of British American name with Catholic roots and then kind of European roots. And then there's a Chinese middle name and a Korean last name. Yeah. Truly global, truly cosmopolitan.
Global. Yeah. Fitting for our podcast.
Definitely. I love the evocative names. And I love thinking about names. I actually mentioned it to my spouse and she said, "Oh, I wonder what Philippa's nickname's going to be." And of course, it hasn't had time to evolve naturally, but maybe it already has. But we're just imagining what you might call her when you have to refer to her really briefly without.
Yeah, I've heard Pippa. I've heard Philly.
Exactly.
I think there's a couple of different variations.
Yeah. And somehow Pippa seems quite adorable. I mean, so anyway, I guess we'll see what happens naturally. But
yeah, hopefully she'll be naturally good and virtuous.
Yeah. Besides naming, which I feel like we could go on all day about the names, I feel like I should ask you how you're doing. I mean, so are you extremely sleep deprived right now, or is the baby sleeping so much that you're actually doing relatively well? Or
no, just sleep deprived. But this is the fourth kid, so I've been through the rodeo. And you know what? The Taoists are right. Everything changes. You just got to keep thinking that, everything is in flux. And sometimes you don't sleep well. Sometimes you sleep better. Right now, I'm in the period in which I'm not sleeping well, but that's okay.
Well, I always thought everyone describes their first child as really kind of undermining their confidence because they discover for the first time that there's this really hard job that requires lots of improvisation and innovation and just constant sort of reinventing of their schedules and routines and such, and they're just overwhelmed with it. I always imagine that by the time you have your third child, you start to feel like an old pro. And so that maybe by the time you reach your fourth child, you actually have a kind of template that you can follow and the parenting comes naturally.
Well, part of it is just the indifference that kicks in. Yeah. I mean, to be honest with you, because we have so many kids and, you can't be so like worried all the time. And I have friends who have even more kids and they're pretty feral, and the kids and they're out there. And I'm even a little bit surprised by how loosey they are, but usually they turn out okay. So maybe, it's the opposite of helicopter parenting. I'm not sure what is the term for that. I don't know. Free range parenting.
Free range parenting. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So the kind of view of parenting that I always wanted to attribute to Mencius, the one who thinks that human nature is good. Like, so long as your child is well fed and, gets some care and love and affection and that kind of thing, the basic needs are met. A lot of the natural mechanisms for sort of good development will kick in. And so that's the more enlightened way to go about it.
Yeah, you're a gardener, not a carpenter.
Exactly. Yes. You're not recarving or reshaping your child. You're just nurturing. Yeah. Yeah. Cultivating. Okay, good. It's nice to catch up with you, Richard. This is actually, we're recording this after we've done today's interview.
Yeah.
And this was a genuine discussion. So Richard and I haven't actually had a chance to catch up. We've been so busy. So this was my first chance to ask about Philippa and the naming conventions and all that. But yeah, we have a really great discussion in store for today, which is an interview of the philosopher Jing Hu, family name Hu, H-U, who's written this terrific article on shame and Confucianism. And so I wanted to just introduce the topic a little bit before we play the recording. So it's basically about shame and Confucianism. And I just feel like it would help a little bit to kind of motivate the article so that listeners can have a sense of what's both controversial about it and novel and original, what makes a real contribution to philosophical scholarship on this issue. So let's just say a little bit about shame, if that's okay with you. I feel like some people just say, well, you don't need to define shame or give an account of it. We know it when we see it. Maybe that's true, but just to make sure we're all on the
That's right. For me, I have a theoretical interest in shame, but I must say, as the epistemologist, I think would call it a knowledge by acquaintance of shame as well. So it's, it operates at both. We've all, I think, felt it. We kind of know what it is, but it's interesting to ask about what its role is, or as we'll see, some philosophers think it's better discarded. It's kind of a moral emotion from a bygone age. But Jing Hu makes a great case for it, I think.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of people think that shame is, not just a lot of people, but shame is generally controversial. It's controversial in moral psychology and philosophy, but also just in life. There are a lot of people who say that, we should ignore that part of ourselves that tells us we should feel ashamed about things. And a lot of philosophers defend more sort of stronger or defend in a more systematic way that view. So why is it controversial? I'm just going to mention two reasons it tends to be controversial, because those are going to be particularly relevant for Jing's article. So one is that we think of shame as something that both tracks and reflects basically what we think of as pretty crude and morally superficial values. So people are ashamed about being not having enough money, shamed about not living up to some ideal body image or what have you, about wearing, bad clothing or what have you. Those are many people's views, not things that you should feel ashamed of because they're trivial. They're morally trivial. They're just crude, superficial values. They're just not the kind of things that we should let govern our lives to a great extent because they don't matter that much at the end of the day. So a lot of people think that's one reason we should really be skeptical of shame as a way of kind of motivating reform and moral behavior and that kind of stuff. Another reason, though, that really comes out in a lot of Western philosophy is that shame seems like it's socially imposed. So when you think of these sort of paradigmatic cases of shame, they're always like other people regard certain behavior as shameful. And so you too decide that it must be shameful and feel ashamed of that behavior. So you kind of think of it as an imposition of social values on individuals, or imposition of conventional values on individuals, whether the individuals agree or not. Right.
And also, isn't there this element of like you want to hide it? And there's something we find a bit problematic sometimes when you try to kind of hide things into like dark corners of your mind because you feel this kind of hurt or pain. And I think some more modern people are worried about that kind of thing too.
Yeah. So Martha Nussbaum, who's kind of the most influential contemporary author on philosophy of shame, she says that when you feel shame, that's sort of accompanied characteristically by the feeling that you want to hide or conceal what's shameful. So I think that's right.
But a classic case is in Genesis when, right, after they eat the fruit, the first thing that they feel is shame, and then they cover their, the private parts up. And actually, David Velleman has a really interesting article on that. I don't know if you've ever read it.
No, I haven't.
Yeah, he explores that whole scene of what exactly is the nature of shame. And it has to do with, like, I think revealing something you don't want to reveal, something like that is part of it, at least.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So shame is controversial. But now let's say a little bit more about shame in the Confucian tradition. So I basically think that if you do even a kind of light surface level reading of Confucian passages on shame, you'll quickly see that it's not supposed to have either of the two kind of problematized features that I just mentioned. It's not supposed to be just something that is socially imposed that you adopt passively and uncritically. And it's not supposed to track superficial and crude values like shame about being poor, or shame about not living up to some ideal body image. So it's pretty clear for that the Confucian philosophers, shame is supposed to be quite different. So for example, in the Analects, the text that's traditionally attributed to Confucius and his students, it's just wrong and kind of an abuse of shame if you feel ashamed of bodily deformity or poverty or wearing shabby clothes. And Confucius, there's kind of the story Analects 5.1, where Confucius and his students presumably are talking about someone who's sort of well known in the community because he's a convicted criminal. And in ancient China at the time, if you're a convicted criminal, you would have some really obvious physical marking to so that you would be kind of live for the rest of your life a highly stigmatized person. Either they would tattoo you or they'd cut off a part of your body, like your nose or what have you. So it was really kind of this visual reminder that he was a convicted criminal. But Confucius believed quite emphatically that he was innocent of the crime, and so therefore had no compunctions whatsoever about marrying one of his daughters to this person.
It's amazing that someone could do that. I mean, just the social pressures that must have existed then.
Exactly. I mean, I cringe a little bit because I feel sorry that his children, including his daughter, had so little say over her marriage. But but it's still the fact that he just seems totally indifferent to the kind of perceived social stigma and only cares about whether this guy has truly committed a criminal act or not, I think is really, it's very moving. And again, this goes to show that he has a sense of shame, and he recommends to others a sense of shame that doesn't just track the kind of crude superficial values and doesn't just accept uncritically or passively social values or the things that other people regard as shameful. And then I guess maybe I'm going on too much, but I just wanted to mention that for those of you who are interested in kind of Confucian theories of governance and political philosophy, there's a super famous passage in the Analects where Confucius basically says, instilling or cultivating a sense of shame in people is a much better way to govern people than reliance on laws and coercion, the use of force. So he says, if you try to guide common people with coercive regulations and keep them in line with punishments, the common people will become evasive and have no sense of shame. But if you guide them with the power of virtue and keep them in line by means of ritual, the people will have a sense of shame and rectify themselves. So the idea is that somehow a sense of shame is necessary to have a kind of self-governing or autonomous moral or lawful behavior. And that's a much better way to kind of solve social coordination problems than to just sort of threaten them,
Yeah, I was about to say a carrot rather than the stick, but it's not quite a carrot, although it's like a moral carrot. I don't know.
Right, exactly. You're right. It's kind of, you're tempted to say it's a carrot because at least we're not threatening. We're not threatening to inflict bodily harm on people or what have you, or imprison them. But on the other hand, you do worry that by cultivating a sense of shame, people will be exposed or now vulnerable to a different kind of
internal sanction.
Right, which could be an internal stick. Yeah, you could wield the stick internally. Yeah. The long and short of it is, if you read the Analects, it's quite clear that there's a really interesting conception of shame and the sense of shame that's at work there. And so Jing Hu's article is trying to do justice to it. And if you read the Mencius, another foundational text in the Confucian, I mean, he's quite explicit. The sense of shame is basically the sprout of the virtue of righteousness. You need a sense of shame if you're ever going to develop the virtue of righteousness. Is essentially the virtue of kind of fulfilling certain socially prescribed and warranted or justified duties, even when they're hard, even when it requires some sacrifice or when it exposes you to embarrassment or loss. You can't develop the virtue that enables you to do the right thing, even when it's quite difficult, unless you have a sense of shame. So clearly, shame is a positive thing. It's a more autonomous thing, and it's not just something that tracks values that we've uncritically adopted from society. And her article's all meant to kind of both clarify what the Confucian account is and justify it, sort of explain why that's a compelling picture of shame and its role in moral development, moral cultivation. We've already finished the interview. It went so well that we found that it spilled over. In fact, when Richard hit the stop record button, we talked for another 15 minutes about it. Kind of regret that we did stop recording. But I hope our listeners enjoy it. It's follow up on this topic.
Absolutely. We could have kept talking for sure another hour.
Yeah.
That was great. So I hope everyone enjoys the conversation. Okay, so we're going to have a brief intermission. And when we come back, we'll introduce our guest, Jing Hu. We are delighted to be joined by Professor Jing Hu, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada. Welcome, Jing.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Justin, for having me here.
Well, we should say a little bit more about our guest. And Justin, I think you already know her. Do you want to do a little introduction for us?
You bet. Yeah, so she's primarily here to talk about her article, Shame, Vulnerability, and Change, which she published in the Journal of the American Philosophical Association last year. That's 2022, if people are listening to this in future years. But she works on a number of really interesting and important topics. Well, she's one of the many people I know who works on Confucian moral psychology very broadly, which means that she's in that club of people that I can basically speak to all day. I remember we bumped into each other on a plane from Hong Kong to San Francisco once, and we could just go on for hours. In addition to kind of moral psychology broadly construed, she works on empathy and moral progress, which I find very intriguing. And unlike me, she actually knows the contemporary social science literature on her topics. So she doesn't just read about shame, empathy, and these other sort of issues through historical lens. But anyway, that's kind of my quick overview. I should let Jing say a little bit more about herself. Do you want to give us a quick introduction, Jing?
Yeah, of course. So I now teach classes in Chinese philosophy and in ethics. Like Justin was saying, I'm really interested in emotions, especially some of the negative ones, because I think they tend to have a closer tie with social issues that we now face today. And I think there are just valuable insight in the Confucian tradition that would help us navigate some of the topics that we face today in social justice or in systematic problems we see today. So that's kind of like my primary interest in philosophy, kind of like joining connections between Confucian texts and, contemporary issues, seeing why people have different views on, emotions like shame or guilt, or are the ancient understanding of this ancient emotions still relevant and then still helpful in our today's world. And spoiler alert, I do think they're very helpful and relevant. And that's one of the examples is the paper that we're going to talk about today.
Nice. Yeah, that's certainly a good approach. I feel like that goes right to the heart of how Richard and I work on Chinese philosophy too. It's kind of funny the way I put it sometimes to people is I am a historian of philosophy. As you guys know, I'm very historical. Like I spend a lot of time just kind of trying to understand old texts. But at the end of the day, I am a philosopher, which means that some sort of standard of relevance, however distant and removed from my kind of actual written work, is still being applied. Like it still matters at the end of the day whether this stuff is sort of philosophically important, and that presupposes that it's relevant in some way. Anyway, I really like the way that you framed it. Yeah, so we're going to talk about the article. It's a really rich article. We're going to put a link in the show notes and encourage everyone to read it. As a point of entry, what I take to be the two main claims of the article. It's hard, of course, to distill it to just two, but here's my attempt, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Jing. So I take the primary claims to be, first of all, that Confucian accounts of shame, which is to say, accounts of shame that come from the traditional Confucian texts, especially the classical Confucian texts like the Analects and the Mencius, they give individuals a certain amount of autonomy. So it's not just on the Confucian account that people should internalize social or communal standards uncritically or passively. They have some control over what sorts of standards they internalize. So that's one really important claim and super interesting. There's a lot to say about it. The other one, I think, is just that it's kind of an upshot, really, of the first one, which is that on the Confucian view, shame is not a destructive emotion. So it can play a positive or constructive role in moral change and moral growth. Is that right, more or less?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's spot on, actually.
Good.
So I'll say just a little bit about the second claim that you just mentioned, which is one of my agenda that I'm trying to push, is that I think it's very common for people to realize that the Confucian understanding of shame is a little bit normative. So it's not just a natural description of how shame is in our natural world. It's a more virtualized sense of shame, like how it is going to be like if you are cultivated, if you're a moral sage, what your sense of shame is going to be like. But I think sometimes people don't realize the kind of prevalent shame that we describe in our society. Sometimes there's also some hidden assumption there, such as that we can't really resist it. The moment is cast upon us, we are just on the receiving end. And I think that's also maybe the opposite of giving it a normative role, maybe a negative normative role, thinking that it's just going to damage our moral autonomy, psychology, and moral lives. So I think that's equally problematic. So I do think that the way we construct and understand emotion need to include all the possibilities this emotion could bring us. And I think it has practical significance as well, because simply recognize, oh, it's a bad, destructive emotion. I don't think that's particularly helpful for people who are struggling with it, especially for people who are in an unfortunate situation that their shame happen to them constantly as a social pattern. So that's one of the reasons why I thought the Confucian understanding of shame would really help. Maybe not everyone can eventually become an exemplary person, be a dreams or be a sage, but recognizing the possibility that this can be managed, can be changed for individuals and more for societies. And I just thought that's really, really important.
Yeah. So that definitely emerges in the article, that you're not just trying to jettison or completely eschew shame. You're not trying to get rid of it. You're offering some way for people who do experience shame in their lives and yet want to somehow get it under control or rein it in. I may not have done justice to the view here, but maybe we could actually kind of probe that a little bit more. Basically, the way you characterize it at one point in the paper is you say, you think that the Confucian account gives us a way of fighting back against bad standards of shame. And in the introduction, I'm going to say a little bit more about the ways in which people often think that shame imports bad standards. So it often attaches to things that we consider kind of morally trivial, like, sort of failing to meet a certain ideal body image, or wearing shabby clothes, or in some way not conforming to some sort of trivial standard. We think those standards are bad. You think that we should fight back against them. It's not that we should just forget about shame completely or somehow ignore it, or just overcome it. And probably the most influential recent philosopher to write about shame is Martha Nussbaum. I like to spell out names for our listeners so that they can actually kind of visualize the name. So her last name is Nussbaum, and she's written very influentially about shame. She's kind of an anti-shame person. So she thinks that basically we're better off without shame completely. And that's a view that you resist, really interestingly. So how would you characterize your view exactly relative to that sort of extreme one?
First, I should try to clarify a little bit. I think in Nussbaum's defense, her argument is that we should really get rid of shame, especially if we're considering the legal system, which is a point that is not hard to get on board if we have a modern understanding of the punishing or the legal system. Even though, in the past, shame is frequently used as a means of punishment, like parading someone like a murder in a market or something, right? Not only shames the offender, but also sends out a social signal to everyone else who is watching. But I think the biggest problem of just trying to say, hey, let's just reject shame, it seems to me it's never clear what that means. we can't, like, as a society, what does it mean? Like, as a society, let's say, let's just reject shame. Like, let's just don't talk about it. If you're feeling shame, well, don't, right? It's a bad emotion for you. Don't, right? Like, if someone comes to you, say, oh, I feel so ashamed because of my body image, or, someone look at me because I'm different, and then just say, hey, don't, it's a bad emotion. I just think that's not helpful at all. And also not realistic based on human psychology and basically how society works. So that's my biggest concern here. And I do think there are a viable approach to see how it can be managed. Again, I want to emphasize not only as an individual, but as a responsibility for society, how those things can be managed. I think Justin mentioned when you were summarizing my paper, one keyword you said was that the Confucians maintain that we can't just internalize external values uncritically. So I think that's a very important point, because basically what they're saying is that there is this thing called internalization, or not necessarily internalization, it could be externalization as well. There is this thing that our internal value and external value would interact.
Yeah.
And we can't pretend that that thing does not happen. If we don't deal with that theoretically in practice, then in the Confucian tradition, we're giving up moral cultivation. Or in the real world, we're giving up a big chunk of space in ethics, in philosophy, in moral psychology. We're just not going to talk about it, right? For the Confucians, it's really, really important the moment we stump upon a value, when the value makes me feel, let's say, shame because I don't have fashionable clothes, right? Yeah. I think about, why am I feeling this way? Why are people glare and make me feel bad? Then I reflect upon, is it because I'm vain? Is it because, this community that I just stumbled upon, they are really not my friends? They're not the community I should align myself with? Then you do some kind of reflection and you realize, okay, maybe either I move away from this community because this is a value I do not want to embrace, or I do something else, find a new community to, align myself with. Or sometimes, of course, it doesn't always happen in the most optimal way. So maybe I will just give up my other values and surrender to the values of this community. So I think that process of this monitoring and managing this internalization, or just what values we let into our system so that they could impact us in a very meaningful way, and what values we reject, I think that's just a very, very important thing. And for people who would just say, let's just reject shame together, I think they're giving up that territory. They're giving up that ground entirely, which I think is a theoretical concession we should not be giving up at all.
I had a quick question following up on your points there, Jing. So one question I had was, there should be certain things we should be ashamed of, or certain actions and behaviors, and certain things that we shouldn't be ashamed of, maybe like something like not wearing super hip clothes. How do we determine, like, first of all, I guess one question I would have is, are you a realist about this? So like, in the sense that, are there objective truths here, or is it just like, reflect on it on my own? But are we getting at some truths about what in fact is or is not shameful behavior? Or how does your what we might call meta ethics go regarding shame?
So my personal opinion is that I am not an realist in general or on this particular topic, but I would like to go back a little bit to the classic texts, right? Because sometimes people would assume, Confucius would say, hey, you should be ashamed of this, you should be ashamed of that, right? But actually, if you really look into the Analects, the 论语, Confucius actually never, only in a few really rare examples, he give examples like, you should not be ashamed of shabby clothes. And you should not be ashamed of, let's say, having a lower social position. So it seems that the examples he gave mostly focus on, don't be ashamed of something just because other people would look down upon you, right? Like appearance, don't be ashamed of your appearance. Those are examples he gave. But other than that, he actually didn't say you should be ashamed if you're not virtuous enough, or if you're not benevolent, if you're not, righteous. So he actually did not really say any of those. And then the same goes for Mencius, actually. And the Li Ji, the Book of Rights. If you really look very closely, and I do want to make a distinction, I think Confucius and Mencius can be put into kind of like one basket, and the Xunzi is a little bit different. So for Confucius and Mencius, interestingly, including the Book of Rights, Li Ji, whenever they talk about something that someone should be ashamed of, they just give this very vague thing to say, hey, when your inner virtues do not line up with some kind of external manifestation of your internal qualities, that's something to be ashamed of. Like if I'm not a very generous person, I'm a very extremely stingy person, then I try to pass myself off as someone who is extremely generous, right? Then Confucius and Mencius would say that's something to be ashamed of. Or Mencius goes even further to say, well, if your reputation does not match up with your inner virtues, that's also something to be ashamed of if you're not doing something about it, right? Like if I'm all of a sudden someone says, oh, Jing's a great runner, she's going to run a marathon, right? And I did nothing to stop that rumor from spreading. Then Confucius and Mencius would also say, well, that's shame on you because you let your reputation, which is extremely unfounded, to go spreading around. Your reputation exceeds what you actually have. So I would actually say that for Confucius and Mencius, at least, what they value the most is some kind of consistency, some kind of like consistent pattern between our inner quality and outer manifestation of those, either through our words, our deeds, or our reputation. And then as for the specific content of what is shameful and what is not, surprisingly, actually, neither of these philosophers prescribed anything. So it's actually kind of like a flexible, I would say a flexible account.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, so can I quickly follow up there? So like, I guess I would have thought, I don't know, like Confucius does talk about the opposite of Yan Hui character. He gets compared to a dung on a wall.
Zaiwo or
Zaiwo, because he's sleeping during the daytime, right? A lot of my students, when I talk about that passage, are like, come to defense of Zaiwo a little bit there.
Yan Hui is sort of Confucius's star student. He died tragically young, but Confucius even says at one point that Yan Hui is in some ways kind of quicker than him, quicker to internalize the lessons of the traditional Confucian way and that kind of thing. And then Zaiwo is often held up as an example of a really bad student. He sleeps in late. He's lazy in various ways. There are other bad students too, of course.
The student who brings up like, oh, do we have to mourn for our dead parents for 3 years? And, Confucius is like, well, if you can't do it, then, later on, he's like, see how unfilial, and he's kind of critical, right? So Jing, it sounds like the way you read Confucius and Mencius, so what they're talking about is a failure to live up to the internal standard that one sets up for oneself. And when you fail to do that, then you feel maybe shame, or you should. But it sounds like you don't think they are thinking that there are certain kinds of actions or behaviors or failures of virtue that just objectively makes the act shameful. So, because I was thinking, what if you have very bad internal standards and you're just a terrible, terrible person and you think you should do all kinds of terrible things? And then let's say, I guess, that person does it and I guess shouldn't be ashamed because they met their internal standards. But I don't know. Would Confucius and Mencius really, would they say that? Or would they be like, well, that person is just shameless, or that person is just, still like those are shameful acts. But according to your view, they wouldn't say that. Do I have that right?
I think they would say that, but shame wouldn't be a very helpful motivator for these people, which is probably why that's the only thing that's left other people can do. Like imagine someone who is a terrible, terrible king, right? Terrible ruler, like the king of Jie, which is, frequently talked about as opposed to the sage kings. He was just a terrible king, right?
Yeah.
Even though he's terrible, but he's still super powerful. And he's a morally corrupt person, so you can't expect him to say, oh, I should feel ashamed when I do something bad. But maybe other people can still say, hey, shame on him. Like the passage says that people compare Jie to the sun, that the sun in the sky, they were like, oh, I hope the sun would expire. I hope that Jie would, something bad would happen to him. So I think people can shame on him, shame on you, right? Jie should absolutely feel shameless, but he himself probably wouldn't. So if we're focusing on his own self-moral cultivation, shame is not going to be useful because he likely have already given up on his own moral cultivation. So shame doesn't really have a way to get to him, right? But the very fact that people have the urge to say, hey, shame on you, I think it actually shows the sociality of shame, not just a personal emotion. Actually, there's a lot of things about shame. It's about social signaling, or about, showing our own views that I think someone like Jie should be ashamed of himself. And I feel like compelled to express that.
You could feel ashamed of like your kid's bad behavior too, it seems. Like my kid acts badly. I didn't quite fail to meet up to my internal standards, maybe, because I didn't do anything, but I'm like, I raised you better. I mean, maybe I feel ashamed as a bad parent. Yeah, maybe that's what goes on.
That's an interesting topic too. And I think that's true both to the Chinese tradition and to the kind of actual psychology of shame as we experience it. I mean, but yeah, I just wanted to say in your article, Jing, you have the resources to respond to Richard's worry about shame being really idiosyncratic and just responsive to one's own internal standards, because you cite favorably and discuss favorably the work of Cheshire Calhoun. That last name is spelled Calhoun. Really interesting moral philosopher. She's opposed to the kind of what she calls the moral pioneer view of shame, where everyone just pioneers their own conception of what's shameful and what's not, what's right and what's wrong, responsive purely to their own autonomous standards. She thinks that's wrong, because what it means to be a member of a moral community and sort of take other people as members of moral communities seriously and respectfully is to have a sense of shame, to be responsive to people's indications of shame or shaming behavior. So it seems to me like on your reading, Jing, the Confucians wouldn't necessarily say that people are just free to make up whatever standards they want. There's this really interesting view that you're developing that shame is both autonomous, which is to say responsive to one's own internal or personal standards, and heteronymous, which is to say responsive to other people's standards too. You kind of want to split the difference. And it's really hard to kind of tease out the ways in which that's true on your account. I'd love to hear a little bit more about it. But hearing you speak just now about it, Jing, made me think, well, at the very least, we could say this. Let's say that I decide that when it comes to clothing, I shouldn't be ashamed at all of the clothing that I wear. So I take this idea that shabby clothing is nothing shameful so seriously. So I'm just like going to people's funerals and weddings, wearing like a holy shirt that has like, that's tattered and falling apart, and really scuffed cuffs on my pants, and like old tattered shoes that the soles are falling off as I walk and what have you. And it seems really disrespectful. And people kind of look askance at me. They look at me with like skeptically, like in other words, they sort of signal that I'm behaving in a shameful way. You could say, at the very least, I should have enough of a sense of shame to pause and reflect on why it is that people are treating me this way, you see? And I think that's at least that's kind of a minimum threshold that Confucians would expect of me, is that even if I have my own internal standards, which say it shouldn't matter at all how I dress, still I have to be at least responsive enough to other people's shame regarding behaviors and shame regarding actions to contemplate whether it is in fact the case that I'm being shameful. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a super important point, because one of the first things we may have to revisit is that there are some common assumptions in the Confucian philosophy, in Confucian ethics. For example, that we are constantly improving or forming our moral standards. And also, while we were doing that, we're not just randomly picking something, right? I'm not just randomly decide I'm going to be a very generous person, or I'm going to give up on some other standard, like being hardworking or being trustworthy. A lot of those are formed in a process of, I will use David Wang's word, which is co-development.
Yeah.
With other people in the community, which means that eventually I become the kind of moral agent who I am, not because I just, what was the hat called in Harry Potter?
Sorting hat.
The sorting hat, exactly.
Yes, I have children.
Right, not because I went to college and then they put a sorting hat on me and then they just decide, here are the moral principles you're going to...
Well, actually, by the way, the sorting hat does give you some choice. In fact,
okay.
Harry Potter is thought to be better in Slytherin, but he hates it. So sorting hat allows him to make his choice at the end of the day.
Thank you for this clarification, Richard. The idea is that we eventually become the kind of moral agent we are as a process of mutual influencing and mutual learning from our community members, right? From teachers, from peers, from parents, and from reading texts and reflecting on ourselves. Which means that eventually the moral principles that we think are the most important, they're a result of both our own effort and conscious choices, and also of other people's influences. Of course, there is the thing about we're not just going to sit here and then accept any influence, right? That's why the being critical of other people's influence is so important in Confucian tradition. That's one of the things they are always reflecting about, right? Like when my teacher or my friend influenced me this way? Is this really aligning with the rest of my beliefs? Is it really good? Would that have a long-term negative consequence, right? In that way, all those moral standards eventually constitute who we are already a result of communal lives. Like all the students like Zaiwo and Yan Hui lives in that Confucius Academy, right? They're always talking, reflecting. So it was never assumed that have a more individual focused, like not communicating with others and just read some text and then decide this is the kind of person I am. And that being said, also this echoes with what Justin was just saying earlier. The whole Confucian tradition, communal activities are such an important thing that we should always allow Confucius and Mencius and Xunzi and Songzi. They always think about, actually, except for Songzi, they always think that this kind of communication, moral communication with others are so important. So if other people think you did something right, or if people think you did something bad, you're not supposed to let them dictate your moral behavior just because other people praise you or condemn you. But you should at least have a way for them to reach you so that you can think about, whether they make sense or not, whether the condemn or praise are right or not. What the Confucians would absolutely be opposed to is just to close oneself off. And we see this in today's world a lot. When people want to criticize someone, we just say, oh, they're just jealous. I dismiss them entirely. I dismiss their points entirely because I know who I am. So that's not what the Confucians have in mind at all. They do not want you to dismiss others' opinions at all. It's just that you have to take in other people's opinion, think about them, but you also have a firm belief, firm understanding of who you are, of your own moral understanding. And the term that I think that would be helpful to distinguish the two types of, either have a connection with the rest of the world or don't have a connection with the rest of the world. I think the second type, sometimes people would just refer to as shameless. Someone who doesn't give any regard to what other people thinks. We would just say that person is shameless. That cannot be shamed.
Yeah, shamelessness itself is a really interesting theme and topic in Confucian, traditional Confucian philosophy, and you have interesting things to say about that too. I kind of feel like it comes out in examples. It's just easy to think of someone who's so indifferent to what other people think is shameful that they don't even give it serious consideration. They don't even give it the kind of minimum respect that you would expect a person to give to other people's standards. So if I'm just walking into funerals wearing really disrespectful clothes with offensive slogans on the t-shirt or whatever, that seems like a kind of shamelessness. Yeah. So if it's right with you, I'll ask a question of a cue from your paper here on this question of shamelessness. You point out that for Mencius or Mengzi, two different ways of romanizing his name, shamelessness is basically a really bad thing. He says, if you're shameless, you're essentially a beast. You're not even human in a way. And at one point in your article, if it's okay with you guys, I'm going to quote the article. I just like the way you put it. Page 387. The reason for Mencius's harsh lament is that without a sense of right and wrong and a responsiveness to what is shameful and what is not, one cannot establish a communicative channel between oneself and others. All right. I think that's really interesting. You need a sense of shame in order to have a communicative channel between yourself and others. In contrast, you say, Jing, such a responsiveness opens the door to moral improvement and change, which the individual can moderate according to her own standards. Okay, so that's really interesting idea that you need a sense of shame in order to have this kind of communicative channel. So my question is, I'm as someone who sometimes teaches these pretty idealistic philosophers, the Taoist philosophers, the Stoic philosophers from the Hellenistic tradition, there is this ideal out there that someone could have a kind of openness to other people's views without having a sense of shame. I take this to be, maybe it's a kind of highly rationalized picture of the human moral agent or something, but imagine someone who like me, by the way, I'm not like this at all. If people look askance at me at a funeral, I'm going to start questioning myself and doubting myself very quickly. But let's just say that there's this really kind of shameless version of Justin. And so I go to a funeral wearing really disrespectful clothes and people are kind of whispering behind my back and, glaring at me. But let's say that my response to the people who say, oh, you're shameless, Justin, is something like, yes, I am shameless. I admit that. But still, I am a rational person. If you have a good argument for wearing more respectful clothes to funerals, I will hear it. I'll hear you out and I'll weigh the arguments and decide whether they're true, or whether they sort of meet the standards that are my deepest convictions or what have you. And so in that case, my response is sort of like, yes, I'm shameless, but I still have these open lines of communication with others. What would you say to that?
No, I think this is a really interesting example because that's something I've been thinking about a lot. I'll also give you an example. There are tons of bakeries here in Montreal, and a lot of them are like really nice neighborhood French bakeries. And they are really proud of their crafts. So at one point, if you go into a bakery and you have one of their, best almond croissant, and you say, "Hey, is this fresh?" They will be so offended. You ask, "Is this from today?" They will be so offended. They would want you to get out of their bakery, basically. And well, as in a different scenario, I've also lived in other places where people are less passionate about their bakery, about their baked goods. If you go into this pastry place and you ask, "Is this one fresh?" They were like, "Oh, let me go back and check. If they're not fresh, I'll give you a discount." Right? Wow. So in those cases, you will see, yes, there's the communicative channel. You would even think that the people who are super passionate, they would have sort of kind of closed off the communicative channel more because they are so emotionally invested in what they do. I think the difference would be that in the first case, the baker really takes pride in whatever they are doing. So in the same way, they would actually feel ashamed if it was proven that they were falling short of the standard they have been matching themselves up to. They would think, "Okay, you think I'm selling you day-old goods and I'm passing something old as fresh? What do you think other bakers would look down upon me if I did that? My, grandmother who taught me this, she would be ashamed of me if I did something like this." The point I'm trying to get is that for the Confucians, and also I think it's true in some other traditions like the Aristotelian tradition, that a sense of shame is actually not about when and how you would feel shame. It's about something that you really value. And then sometimes it's closely related to dignity and pride. So it's something that they really are proud of themselves, that when we were proven that we were short of that, then a sense of shame arise. Oh. So the way I think of how the Confucius Mencius view shame, also Confucius once said that when someone has an adequate sense of shame, I can send him to far away, distant quarters without worrying that person's going to do something bad. He doesn't worry about that person is going to do something bad or humiliating because that person have an internalized high standard of himself so that he would not do something beneath that. And we can kind of see that there was this one case, which is a lot of times highly debated in Mencius as well, where a beggar was asking for food.
6A10, yeah.
Yeah. And someone provided food, but in an extremely abusive manner, kicks the beggar and then say, "Eat." And then the beggar basically reject the food and also reject the insulting treatment, therefore kind of preserved his own dignity, right, in a way, basically by signaling what you're doing is beneath me, and perhaps you should feel ashamed of yourself by treating someone else like this. It seems to me a sense of shame is so important to Mencius, at least, and Confucius. It's precisely because it's associated with a sense of inner moral identity and moral, almost like moral dignity and then pride.
Yeah.
So I would think in this case, for Confucius and Mencius, they would think is very essential and irreplaceable by other more rational version of agent. Even though I do think maybe by today's standard that the kind of inner pride that we have, maybe they are not evoked so frequently, and they should not always be. But I do think for Confucius Mencius, at least, they think a mature moral agent or a exemplary person, they definitely need to have that as a backbone of their moral agency. But personally, I remain kind of neutral on whether a sense of shame and pride is necessary for moral agency. Like you were saying, maybe a highly rationalized version of individual could also have mature moral agency. And especially if you don't subscribe to the virtue ethics framework, right, then you don't necessarily have to have a moral agency constitution relying on pride and shame.
I have a follow-up about this. So I was thinking about Aristotle, and Aristotle talks about shame. And there's been some recent work on Aristotle and shame. Marta Jimenez has this new book, I guess a couple years old now, but it's on shame in Aristotle. And she makes a case that shame actually is an important moral emotion for Aristotle, especially in early childhood development. The youth should have a sense of shame. But he does differ, it seems, at least on the surface for sure, that a sense of shame isn't really necessary anymore once you're virtuous. So that comes out. And I was just thinking about okay, so what is the fundamental point of disagreement there? And I was reading a couple of different articles, one by Christopher Raymond, who has this really nice account of what Aristotle is going for. So I want to see what you thought. One argument that's given, and actually Brian Van Noorden has a really nice paper, which you also cite, very illuminate about why he actually thinks Aristotle goes wrong. It's kind of it's very interesting. But Aristotle at one point does say that, yeah, it seems like, you don't need a sense of shame because a virtuous person wouldn't act shamefully and not have that experience. Okay. But actually there's this other argument given by Christopher Raymond, this more recent paper, where he says, actually the reason why Aristotle doesn't seem to think shame is an important part of the life of a virtuous person is that shame isn't really a proper motivation anymore. You should be motivated by the sense of the fine, the kalon in ancient Greek, or the goodness or badness. And so even in your paper, which really illuminating, and I agree with a lot of it, but you do kind of go back and forth sometimes with sense of shame is very closely connected to a sense of rightness or wrongness. And even in Mencius, of course, or Mengzi, it is connected to the virtue of righteousness. And so I guess I was wondering how that sense of morality, rightness, wrongness, goodness, or badness is different from Confucian sense of shame. Is Aristotle missing something there by only having this apparatus of the fine or the noble? Because maybe Aristotle would say, well, why are you motivated by avoiding something that you feel shameful? Shouldn't you just be motivated by the fact that it's wrong to do? Or is there a real difference there? Or maybe there's not as much of a disagreement. I don't know. These are just some thoughts that were running through my mind. Does that make sense?
Could I just follow up on Richard's follow-up? So here we are, three professional philosophers talking to each other. And I always worry sometimes that there are certain things that are sort of obvious to us that may not be entirely obvious to our audience. But the sort of worry that Richard points to here is kind of a familiar one. So there are ways in which it seems like shame is kind of a problematic moral motive. I mean, if you think about really classic kind of canonical or paradigmatic cases of shame, it's sort of like you're ashamed because you basically are ashamed of how you appear to others. And that doesn't seem like a very good moral motive, right? It seems like, oh, well, I'm embarrassed or or whatever. Because other people see this as shameful, I regard it as shameful. That really seems like it falls well short of what we consider to be virtuous motives. Virtuous motives should have something to do with, on this view, that this kind of Aristotelian view that Richard is advancing, virtuous motives should have something to do with the inherent rightness or wrongness or goodness or badness of,
or baseness. I mean, Aristotle also talks about the base or the noble, the fine. Yeah, when you have this kind of Confucian, very moralized understanding of shame, I've wondered if we're kind of moving beyond kind of the primitive concept of shame having to do with embarrassment and concealment. And then now it's so moralized that I'm wondering if even Kant would be well, yeah, when you think about it like that, I even can talk about that too. I just wouldn't use the word shame like that, but the concept maybe is even found in Kant, with morality and then I'm not sure how guilt even is different from shame anymore. So I'm wondering if it starts sliding into a more of, I don't know, a different concept. That was one worry I had.
So I'm so glad we're here right now because I feel like our intellectual progress actually matches up with how it happened during the warring state.
Oh.
That's why earlier I was emphasizing that, there's a distinction between how Confucius and Mencius talk about shame and how Xunzi, who is this other Confucian philosopher, talks about shame, primarily in responding to some of the other rival philosophers.
So there's kind of a trinity of classical Confucians. There's Confucius and Mencius, and they're often regarded as the orthodox Confucians. Much of what we consider to be orthodox Confucianism today basically builds on the foundations of Confucius and Mencius. There's this third great Confucian philosopher that I think all three of us really love, but isn't considered so orthodox. His name is Xunzi. And for people who don't read Chinese, you probably don't even know how that's spelled. It's spelled Xunzi. Master Xun is his name. And he came at the end of the Warring States period, which is to say he came at the end of what a lot of people consider to be the classical period of Chinese philosophy. And so I'm sorry, Jing, you're about to explain that Xunzi has kind of the most progressive or most advanced understanding of shame, is historically the last of the three of classical Confucian philosophers.
No, thank you, Justin, for clarifying that. First of all, I agree with what Richard said earlier, that the Confucians, the kind of shame they have is highly moralized. There's a certain type of normativity in it. And essentially for Confucius and Mencius, what they are trying to do, they're trying to strike some kind of a balance between shame being a social emotion and being a personal emotion, right? How autonomous we can be and how much pull that others would have on us in the experience of shame. So other people pointing at us if we're in an entirely different culture, in an entirely different unfamiliar situation, we don't know anybody, we walk into a room and everybody was looking at us, right? It's very natural for us to think, did I do something wrong? Am I wearing the right clothes? Did I come in at the wrong time? It evokes this kind of self-consciousness. And if we do sometimes find something wrong with us, I suddenly realize maybe I am wearing a black jacket while as everyone else in the room was wearing a white jacket. I think, oh, maybe I was stupid for doing that. I'm so ashamed of something like that, even though maybe later it turns out that wasn't the reason at all, right?
Yeah.
But what I'm trying to say is that other people have a lot of weight in making us feel at least the first step to shame, which is becoming very self-conscious, starting to look at our own behavior, look at ourselves, self-examination. That may be one of the reasons why in Western literature, a lot of times shame is associated with exposure, a sense of exposure or audience, even though that's a feature that we don't see in Confucian tradition. So my understanding of Confucius and Mencius is that I think they do recognize that. But the reason why they never talk about it is because they think that's a bad form of shame. They don't think shaming other people or feel shame just because other people are looking at me for wearing shabby clothes. They don't think that's a morally good type of shame. They think the morally good type of shame is the kind of shame you take control over the content of it. So I will only be ashamed of what I agree is shameful. Well, as that whole process of taking control is a process in which you kind of navigate and combating with the external values. It's not something I just decide, right? So we talked about this point earlier. So what they had is actually a really idealized and moralized version of shame where they think we really need to focus on our internal beliefs and internal emotions. Even though I do think they recognize the external influence, especially if you think about Mencius. There was this one other passage that he talks about. There was this man lives in the country of Qi, and he has a wife and a concubine. And the wife and concubine found out, even though they were in a poor family, the husband always go out and then came back well fed, and then even had wine, and then very happy and all that. So the wife and the concubine was very curious. So they followed the husband, and to their surprise, they found out what the husband had been doing was he actually just followed those people who went to worship their ancestors. So as part of the funeral rites or ancestor worshiping rites, which is sometimes people would put food and wine as a part of the ritual ceremony. And then the husband would just wait until all those people leave and then, basically steal the food, right? Which is considered extremely shameful behavior.
Stealing food and wine from people's ancestors, essentially, depriving them of the sacrifice for their ancestors. Yeah, very shameful.
Yeah, so what happened in the end though, so this is a text from Mencius. So he's fully aware the wife and the concubine, they went home and what they did was just they cry in their house because they say, well, our husband is such a shameful person and we're crying out of shame. But there's not much they can do, right? They were in this shameful state. They were crying out of shame because of their affiliation and moral dependence with this man. But they can't avoid this shame by their own behavior, right? That by, oh, I'm a virtuous person. I don't care about what my husband does, right? So they actually can't do this. This is the reason why I say Mencius is fully aware that one's situation can bring shame on one.
Real quick, so this is a great example. I love that example. But they're what makes that action shameful, the source of it, can't be a failure to meet one's internal standard, though, right? Because that guy didn't think he was failing. But it's pretty clear that Mencius thought that was shameful behavior. So don't we need a different account of what is the source of shame? I mean, in that case?
I think in that case, the guy doesn't feel shameful, right? So there's not much shame can help him.
That's right. That's right. But it's still a shameful act. So then how do we explain why Mencius thinks that action is shameful?
I think Mencius would agree that that individual does not really agree with or does not really think that behavior is shameful. And also, I think Mencius wouldn't say, hey, here's the objective truth. Like stealing people's food from ancestor worshipping rites, that's shameful. So Mencius doesn't make such a claim, even though he seemed to think that based on common sense, everyone would regard that as shameful. Maybe that's the theoretical difference there. And then what matters in the story is that the two women, they definitely think that's shameful behavior, right? Not only they think that's shameful behavior, they also think being affiliated with someone who has such disregard of their own dignity and moral quality, that's definitely shameful for them, right? To have been married to this individual.
Mm-hmm.
But the point here I want to say is that Mencius definitely, he knows that you can be ashamed just because of the situation you're in, the relationship, affiliation you have, not necessarily because you did something wrong, something bad. So I think there is a tension here. On one hand, the Confucians seem to think that, oh, have your own inner moral standard, right? And then on the other hand, they were like, oh, well, yeah, there are some situations this woman would feel ashamed of their husband and it's due to no fault of their own. What do you do in a case like that? And the Xunzi would even, when it goes to Xunzi, the problem becomes very similar to the example Justin gave also about funerals. So sometimes when you violate certain rituals, people are not very happy about it. And people sometimes spontaneously leaving some signals to make someone aware of their behavior is in line of improvement, like not wearing proper clothes, being disrespectful at a funeral. Then the question is that, well, if I violated certain social norms and a funeral and then rituals, should I feel shame? And then we think, yeah, you should, probably, right? And then on the other hand, the Confucians, especially Mencius and then Confucius, seem to think that, well, no, only feel shame if you think that is shameful. Then we have some kind of like divergent paths even within the Confucian tradition.
Interesting.
So I think this is where kind of our conversation was kind of leading us to. Also that some of the audience might have this reaction too, thinking that the kind of moralized, idealized version of shame Confucius and Mencius propose are just not very much like the shame we experience in our life anymore. So Xunzi is really trying to fix that. So he admit that, well, sometimes we will have this kind of natural shame, especially when we're in some of the situations that's basically designed to evoke shame. For example, like when people were receiving corporal punishment in public, right? When someone who is being paraded in the market for a crime, even if that person think that, oh, I'm innocent, I didn't do it. But in that situation, it's likely that person would still experience shame as a result of being so publicly humiliated or being the target of stigmatization and so on. So she kind of went on to admit that's how shame is.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So Xunzi in some ways has the most kind of mature and realistic. I mean, he still idealizes shame a little bit. Of course, it's a normative account. It's one that we're supposed to strive for, and not one that in fact describes how we are. But he makes allowances for the fact that to a certain extent, we just have to be motivated by other people's sort of social censure and condemnation in being shamed. Whereas for Mencius and Confucius, they still have this kind of ideal view where you're just totally indifferent to popular views. And that seems very unrealistic.
Very small correction. The Confucius and Mencius, they're also not saying we're indifferent to other people's view. And then one person that does think we should be indifferent to other people's view is this philosopher whose name is Songzi. Song, like, Song. He was at the time well known, but his written work did not survive. So we don't actually know a whole lot about him. But he's the one who thinks that in the case of shame and honor, we shouldn't care about anything at all. And we should just disregard the external world altogether.
Yeah. Let me just flag that one for the Chinese philosophy geeks. So the classical period, there were many, many philosophers whose works didn't survive. And it's funny that you mention him. He's an obsession of mine. Yeah. So there was this guy, Songxing, Songxing, but some people thought he was a master. They used the more respectful term Songzi, master Song. And his text didn't survive, but we know that he had certain views. He wanted to distinguish between internal and external goods, it seems like. And he advocated for making the desires few, but not eliminating them entirely. Anyway, it seems like he had really interesting views on sort of conventional versus natural goods or something like that. Well, this has been really wonderful. I feel like, first of all, I feel like we managed to go rather deep into the topic in all kinds of surprising ways. And so I wanted to thank Jing for being so indulgent and letting us ask questions about Aristotle. Yeah.
Wow, that was great, Jing.
And no day would be complete for Richard if he didn't ask a question about Aristotle. And this is our first proper interview for the series, so I won't pretend that it's yet a well-established convention, but we do intend to establish the convention of asking some standard questions of our interviewees at the end. 2 questions, really. So I'll take the first one, first of the closing questions. And this one doesn't have to be, you don't have to answer at great length if you don't want to, but it's simply this. If you could only recommend one text from the Chinese philosophical tradition for people to read, what would it be? What is the one text that you would recommend to people?
Even though we've talked at great lengths about Confucian philosophy, I think I'll have to betray that tradition and recommend a Taoist text. So I would recommend Zhuangzi, actually, just because I think it's so fun to read. There are so many interesting stories there. It's so poetic. And it's also always have been one of the favorite of my students whenever I teach this class.
Yeah.
I would highly recommend Zhuangzi.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's hard to disagree. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So the second question is, if there is one idea from your study of Chinese philosophy, which you think, if adopted, could make a difference in someone's life, what would that idea be?
So this might sound a little bit like cliche to people who are familiar with Chinese philosophy, especially Taoist philosophy. I think the most important idea that I personally got from Chinese philosophy is the idea that any distinction that we make, any dichotomy we have, there's a relationship between the 2 extremes. And frequently the 2 extremes can transfer and turn into each other. So I think this general attitude of looking at changes and looking at how we look at distinctions is extremely important to myself and then to my philosophical thinking as well, which was one point we did not really get to talk about today. Was Xunzi made a distinction between this more naturalized form of shame and a more virtualized or moralized version of shame, which I think is a great distinction he made. But I would criticize him by posing this, age-old Taoist criticism, which is that the moment you make a distinction, you will have to explain the relationship between these 2 and how they transfer into each other. I think precisely that how this natural form of shame transfer into a moralized form of shame, or vice versa, is precisely what Xunzi did not explain. And then it's also precisely what we actually really needed in today's society. For example, for people who are stigmatized, how does that external stigma transfer into internal shame? How do they internalize that? Or how does the internalized moral emotions manifest itself and externalize itself, right? And as it also becomes very frequent that people talk about, self-hate in the case of systematic oppression in racism, that clearly there's a channel of how the world that we live in would affect our inner moral constitution. And I think the early Confucian kind of like gentleman or exemplary person-like assumption that we can always find the nice environment that's help us flourishing and turn things around, that may not always be the case in a lot of circumstances. And we really do need to take that into consideration before we start to celebrate a more virtue-based or self-cultivation-based morality. So I think that is the 2 extremes changing into one another and how they relate to one another. I think that would be the point that I think is most relevant to me personally. And I think also to any philosopher who would like to make any distinction to think about.
Have you
Wow.
read Lisa Tessman's Bird and Virtues?
No.
Oh, okay. Because it's about kind of connected to what you were just saying at the end there about the virtues that we need under conditions of oppression or various challenges from social life. I must say I've only skimmed through it, but it seems connected to what you were thinking there. I don't know if you've read it, Justin.
Yes, of course. Yeah. And in fact, over the years, I feel like supervised a few master's theses that on Tessman. So she comes up quite often. Really interesting book. Yeah. And fascinating answer, Jing, really surprising. I mean, it's a very Taoist point. The Taoists like to raise really deep concerns about moralizing, basically creating value distinctions, especially morally charged ones, like distinctions between noble and base or good and bad. And they have this really interesting way. It's a systematic kind of master critique, and you can piece it together in various ways. But like basically, if society makes a rather cut and dry distinction between good and bad, or good and evil, and then holds goodness in high esteem as something to be instantiated or emulated, there are ways in which that can actually turn into a bad thing, because of course, then you have people striving to be good, primarily out of social pressure. They'll have a kind of Procrustean, very stale, inflexible standard of goodness that they impose on everyone. And of course, people striving to be good just for the sake of, social conformity or what have you, are not necessarily good. I mean, you could say that becomes evil or becomes a kind of badness, kind of vice. Yeah, fascinating. And you're right, that does apply rather well to Xunzi's distinction between natural and virtuous shame. Well, okay, I wish we had more time, but alas, that's going to have to be it for now. I bet shame is going to come up again. Many, many thanks to Jing for a wonderful article and for a wonderful discussion. And we encourage our listeners to read the article, and more work is coming out from her on shame, I happen to know. Our next episode, just to give you a quick preview, is going to be on sort of surprising topic, oneness. It's really about how this idea that you can achieve a kind of mental or psychological state or attitude according to which you see yourself as part of a larger whole, as though you're like part of a larger body. And everyone sort of who's even vaguely familiar with Chinese philosophy knows that this is a major theme, especially in the later post-classical tradition after Buddhism arrives. But it hasn't been theorized very much, with one major exception. This wonderful philosopher, P.J. Ivanhoe, has written a book and multiple articles on it and has really been pushing this as a kind of philosophical theme that needs to be better developed. That's going to be the topic of our next episode. And that was The Way for today, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.